Our second story out front, legislative leftovers. Congress returning to work with a lot on their plate, and we're not talking about Turkey. We're talking about something much more rancid, the fiscal cliff. One of the most urgent matters this lame duck Congress needs to address before the end of the year. And even though the painful across-the-board spending cuts and tax increases are going to take effect in 36 days, there's still only talk of a compromise. So, can Congress actually walk the walk, or are we going to go off this cliff? It is a very real risk, everyone. Up front tonight, Mike Lee, Republican Tea Party Senator of Utah. And good to see you, Senator. Really appreciate your taking the time. So you wrote an op-ed in the Washington Times, and it said, I'll quote you, delaying significant fiscal restraint for yet another year will send the wrong signal to financial markets and may serve as a tipping point that could lead to disastrous consequences for our economy. So your fear is that interest rates could surge. Now, and just to be fair, we've had this disastrous situation for a couple of years, and, you know, interest rates have kept falling in spite of all worries that there would be a disaster.
That's right. That's one of the things that distinguishes the fiscal cliff, which we're coming up against right now, from what I described yesterday in my editorial in the Washington Times as the fiscal avalanche. We can see when the fiscal cliff's about to hit. We can't tell exactly when the avalanche is going to happen. The avalanche occurs when people stop buying U.S. Treasury instruments, and we have to start raising the interest rate. Eventually, we get to the point where we can't afford anything other than interest on our national debt, and that's what I'm concerned about.
So let me talk about the solution here, because you and I talked back in May about this. As you know, we've all been talking about this for a long time. Now we're finally here at the deadline, right? You talked at the time about wanting a simpler tax system, and you were open at the time in our interview to some people paying more, and you said some people in the Republican Tea Party would be okay with that. Here's you on this program back in May.
I make it a point never to speak for my colleagues or my counterparts in the House, but I'm not aware of anyone who would say that if one American might end up paying a little bit more, that would necessarily count them out.
So I want to understand exactly what you mean. Are you open to a compromise in which, if you closed loopholes, some Americans would pay more?
Yes. Look, the point is that we need comprehensive tax reform. And anytime you reform the tax code, you're going to want to do it in a way that stabilizes the tax base. You're hopefully lowering rates, collapsing loopholes, and creating a more reliable, sustainable base. That might mean that some Americans pay more, but that doesn't necessarily amount to a tax increase in the aggregate. What you're trying to do here is to stabilize the revenue stream.
When you say, though, it doesn't amount to a tax increase in the aggregate, that obviously is the center of this whole issue, especially when it comes to the pledge that I know you signed with Grover Norquist, right? He said, I'm okay with closing loopholes, but it has to be revenue neutral. But I think everyone knows that to get a deal done, it can't be revenue neutral. I mean, are you open to a deal where you cut a lot of spending and you raise some taxes and it is not revenue neutral? In fact, you take in more tax revenue when you're done than you did when you started. Are you open to that?
What I'm open to is the idea of acknowledging the fact that we can bring in, on average, 18.5% of GDP through our revenue stream. Now, that's what our tax system is capable of doing in the United States. That remains a constant, whether our top marginal rate is at 35%, as it is now, or at 70%, as it was back in the early 1980s. That's a relative constant. What I want is for us to produce a steady stream of 18.5%, rather than having these peaks and valleys. Last year, we had a valley of about 14.5% of GDP. Other years, we've had something closer to 20%. We want it at a steady, even 18.5%.
But to get from 14.5 to 18.5 right now is not revenue neutral.
Well, to get to there is not net revenue neutral in the immediate sense. But what I'm saying is, if it produces, on average, 18.5% of GDP, and that's going to keep us constant, that is arguably revenue neutral. In the long run, I think everyone would benefit. In the long run, it would be revenue positive. Not every tax increase brings about more revenue. In fact, sometimes you need to lower rates in order to bring in more revenue.
All right, but just to understand where you stand on this, because you know, it sounds to me like you're saying you go against Grover Norquist's pledge, but you don't really want to directly say it. But a lot of your colleagues are saying it. Bob Corker has said it. Lindsey Graham has said it. They've said that they'll allow for more revenue via taxes, however you do it, close loopholes, however you do it, that isn't revenue neutral. I mean, you're saying you agree with that, at least now, but not in the long term, correct?
Yeah, look, I'm saying there are a lot of ways to skin a cat, and we do need comprehensive tax reform. You have to look at something very carefully to decide whether or not you think it is an aggregate tax increase. And so it's very difficult to define in the abstract what is or what is not a tax increase. I am against tax increases, but I am in favor of stabilizing our revenue stream.
Okay, but do you have frustration with Grover Norquist and such an absolutist definition of revenue neutral, right? Because if over time, revenue neutral could mean you never raise any more revenue than you're raising before, but the economy's growing. So by definition, taxes would be going up. That's not revenue neutral, right? I mean, he's put you in a very absolutist position. Does it frustrate you?
And no, look, my pledge wasn't to any one individual. The pledge that I made was to my constituents, to the voters in Utah who elected me, who found it very important, found it very significant that I was willing to say tax increases are not the answer. The answer is that government's got to control spending because we don't have a revenue problem so much as we have a spending problem in Washington.
All right. Thank you very much, Senator. We appreciate your taking the time to join us tonight. It sounds like, I mean, bit by bit, everyone is moving a little bit. There's still some rhetorical issues, as you can hear, but closer and closer to a possible solution here.